right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I am an attorney with Scott Legal PC. Today, we're going to be spending some time talking about, as I mentioned, the TN visa, which is one of the most common visas that we help our clients navigate. And that's for good reason. If you are a national of Mexico or Canada and you're looking to come to the US to work for an employer in the US, there are few options that are as straightforward and simple as the TN visa. So it really is a wonderful option for Canadians and Mexicans. We are also going to talk about one of the most common questions that we get from our clients and their employers about the TN visa, which is whether it requires sponsorship. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. You may know that our founder, Ian Scott, has actually navigated a number of non-immigrant visas, including the E2 and the TN. So his experience navigating that process really does inform the way that we work with our clients and help them navigate the process. We are a full service immigration firm. So although we do focus on business immigration, we handle family immigration cases, humanitarian immigration cases, and really everything in between. So if you have any questions at all involving US immigration, we hope you won't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help. This webinar is part of a series. We try to do at least a couple webinars a week, and those span the full spectrum of US immigration law. So we will send you an email after this presentation where you can sign up for future webinars. In that email, we'll also send you a link to our YouTube channel where we post recordings of our full-length webinars as well as shorter videos. And those, again, cover the full spectrum of US immigration law. So please do check out those links. We are very proud to offer some very high quality information for free on our YouTube channel and on our firm's blog. So we hope you'll find that useful. That email that you'll receive will also have a comprehensive guide to the TN visa, which really collects all of the best information that we have about the TN. And it'll have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that you see on your screen. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. And again, the full-length webinar will be posted to our YouTube channel after the presentation. If you have a question for me, please do feel free to send it in through either the chat function on Zoom or the question and answer function. I'm actively monitoring both. I may save questions for the end, unless it's particularly relevant to what I'm talking about at the time. But either way, I do plan to get through all of the questions. So don't hesitate to send those in to me. I'd be happy to answer those. All right, without further delay, let's go ahead and dive in by talking about the TN visa's requirements. So as I mentioned, the first requirement for a TN visa is that you do need to have a passport from either Canada or Mexico. The TN visa is a visa that stems from NAFTA, so the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. North America Free Trade Agreement. And so basically you do need to have either a Canadian passport or a Mexican passport. Now, country of birth does not matter. So this is not a green card. So what matters is the passport that you're using to apply for the visa on. Now, once you establish that you're a national of Canada or Mexico, you also need to have a job offer. And that job offer needs to be from an employer in the United States. And you need to be coming to the US to work in one of a number of specified occupations. So not every occupation is eligible for a TN visa. So what are the occupations that are on the list? They're actually spelled out in the TN regulations. So if you are at a computer and you want to quickly type into Google NAFTA TN regulations, click that link. Once you scroll down, you'll see a list of occupations, starting with accountant, then architect, computer systems analyst, and the list goes on. You have professors, teachers, mathematician, librarian, veterinarians. There really is quite a long list, and that is the good side of it. The bad side of it is that not every occupation, as I said, is listed. So you do need to be coming to the US to work in one of those listed occupations. The other requirement is that you actually need to be qualified to practice your listed occupation. So let's say that you are coming to the US to work as an accountant. You need to qualify based on the regulations. When I say you need to qualify for it, I'm not talking about qualifying based on what the US employer wants to see. They might want to see 20 years of experience for you to be an accountant. That's not what the regulations require. So that's not what I'm referring to when I say you need to be qualified. What I am referring to is that you need to have accomplished what the regulations say. So as an accountant, you need either a baccalaureate degree or a licenciatura degree, or a professional license to practice as an accountant, a CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. For an architect, you need either a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or a state or provincial license. And the qualifications are unique to each occupation. So if you look as an example at management consultants, you can qualify through a degree or through professional experience, at least 5 years of relevant experience. So the management consultant category is unique there. So once you know what occupation you're going to be coming to the US to work in, check and make sure that you have qualified for it. So let's go back to our slide. Once you have done that, the important thing as well is that you actually do need to come to the US to be performing the job duties of that occupation. So what do I mean when I say that? What I mean is, let's say you went to college, you got a degree in accounting. So on the face of it, you qualify as an accountant, but the employer in the US actually wants you to do their marketing work. You're really good at Facebook, you're really good at Google ads, TikTok advertisements, whatever it is, and a company wants to hire you to do that, that's not going to be approved. And the reason is, if you're coming to the US to work as an accountant, you need to be doing what the US government thinks an accountant does. So how do you figure that out? You do that using a resource that's published by the US Department of Labor called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So again, if you have Google up in front of you, just to take an example, let's go OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook, accountant. And once you Google that, click on that link, and there's a tab at the top, and you can search OOH for any of the occupations in the TN regulations. You'll see a tab toward the top that says what they do. Click on that, and you'll actually see a list of job duties. So what an accountant does, you can see it. I'm not going to read everything, but it says examine financial statements, compute taxes owed, inspect account books, organize financial records, assess financial operations, things like that. You need to be coming to the US to do those things if you're entering as a TN accountant. And again, the same is true for any occupation. Let's say you're coming to the US to work as a veterinarian. You need to look to OOH and see what the government thinks a veterinarian does. And as long as your job duties are aligned with those listed on OOH and the majority of your time is spent doing them, you're usually going to be fine. However, if a minority of your time is spent doing the things listed on the OOH, and most of your time is going to be spent doing something else, that's where concerns can be raised and you need to be careful. So do make sure your job duties are aligned with what the OOH says you'll be doing in your occupation, and that most of your time will be spent doing those things. And you do need to have, I'm looking at the fourth bullet, you must have a prearranged job. So when you apply for a TN, you'll actually take a letter from the US employer that says that they do plan to employ you. It'll say how much you'll be paid. It'll say how many hours a week you'll be working, and really what specifically you'll be doing, as we've been discussing. So you do need to have that job offer actually in hand. So as I mentioned before, one of the most common questions we get is, does the TN visa require sponsorship? And when someone asks this question, what they usually have in mind, or what the employer has in mind, is sponsorship in the context of a green card or a visa like the H-1B visa? The short answer to the question that we would give is no. The TN visa does not require sponsorship. And the reason why is that, as I said, sponsorship is usually thought of as being what an employer has to do when they're sponsoring you for a green card or for an H-1B visa, for example. So what does that mean? That means that in those contexts, not for a TN, but for a green card for the H-1B, typically an employer has to test the US labor market. They need to advertise the job, see if any qualified US citizens or permanent residents apply for the job. They need to pay a prevailing wage, which is going to be higher than minimum wage. They need to provide certain protections, like they cannot say bench the employee. If they come to the US, they need to be actively working. If they're terminated, sometimes the employer will have to pay for their travel back to their home country. Those are all requirements typically in what's considered sponsorship. And again, those do not apply to TN applicants. What does apply for a TN applicant? Really, all the employer has to do for a TN application is provide a letter that details what the person will be doing in the job, what their title will be, what their compensation would be, how they're qualified for the job. Again, the TN qualification, whether that's a degree, whether that's experience, whatever it is, and that the employer intends to employ them in the US. That letter is not a binding contract that the US government will typically enforce. It is the employer's sincere intention. But like most employees in the US, the employee is still at will. So let's say that they come to the US and it just doesn't work out. The employer can still terminate them before that employment period stated in the employer letter has completed. And similarly, the employee can quit. So they're not bound by that letter either. Just because you put in the letter that you intend to employ someone as an accountant for, say, 3 years, does not mean that you can't quit before that 3-year period is up, or the employer can't terminate you. In terms of pay, a TN employer just has to comply with minimum wage requirements, federal minimum wage, local minimum wage. So it's no different from any other employee. They don't have to advertise the job. They don't have to test the labor market and see if they're US citizens or permanent residents who want to perform the job duties. Really, they just need to say, you know what? We want to hire you. You're a national of Canada. We'll give you a letter saying that it's our intention to hire you and how much we want to pay you and what we'll have you doing in the job. The very slight exception of this is if you are within the US and you're applying to change your status to TN status. Say you're a student and on an F1 visa and you want to change status from within the US to TN status, then the employer will sign the form, the USCIS form, which is called the I-129, which basically lays out the details of the job. It does not create any additional responsibilities. It is just that it is technically the employer who applies from within the US. Whereas if you're outside the US and you're applying either at a port of entry or you're applying at a consulate, it is the employee who's applying, who's actually filing that application. So if you're applying within the US, the application materials, other than that form I mentioned, will still be the same. So you'd still have a letter from the employer saying everything that I said before. And that actually is an important difference between Canadians and Mexicans, which leads us to this next slide, which is that either Canadians or Mexicans, both Canadians and Mexicans, can apply at a consulate abroad. They can also apply if they're within the US through USCIS, and that would be a change of status. However, Canadians have the additional option to apply at a port of entry, and that is an extremely convenient option. What it means is that a national of Canada, all they need to do to apply for a TN visa is have their application materials, and they would, if they're in the US, they would leave the US. If they're outside the US, they would enter the US through either an airport or a land crossing. And when they enter, they would approach CBP, Customs and Border Protection, And, typically when you enter the US, you'll tell the border officer what you plan to do and they'll stamp your passport. Here you would just say, I'm applying for a TN status. I have my application materials with me, and they would ask you a few questions. If you're approved, then you would receive TN status, and that is typically issued in periods of 3 years. So CBP would admit you for a 3-year period when you enter in TN status. So extremely convenient for nationals of Canada, and for that reason, we very rarely see Canadians apply for a TN visa at a consulate. There's usually not a good reason for a national of Canada to apply at a consulate. One of the few cases when they might consider doing that is if they have a dependent spouse or child who is not a citizen of Canada, in which case that spouse would need to apply for the dependent visa at a consulate. And just for convenience and the family being together, you will see nationals of Canada apply to consulate in those cases. But assuming that the spouse and child, any dependents, are nationals of Canada as well, then nationals of Canada are almost always going to apply at a port of entry for a TN visa. While we're on the topic of dependents, spouses and children of those who have TN status can get dependent status. So that's called TD status, D for dependent. And this applies to both Mexicans and Canadians. And what that gives you, if you are the spouse or the child of someone who has a TN, TD status gives you the ability to study in the US. It does not give you the ability to work inside the US. So if you are the spouse of someone in TN status and you want to work for a US employer, you'd have to apply for your own TN visa or another status that would allow you to work in the US. But simply accompanying the principal, the TN principal, a TD will allow you to do that. And as I mentioned, to study inside the US. All right, so there are a few categories. I mentioned before that you have to come to the US to work for a listed occupation. I use the example of accountants. I mentioned management consultants. Not all occupations are as easy or as difficult to be approved for. So two categories that are particularly challenging are management consultants and economists. And they're challenging for different reasons. Management consultants, that category is challenging for the reason I mentioned before, which is that it is one of the very few categories that you don't need a degree to qualify for. Almost every other occupational category, you need either a degree or a professional license, and that professional license will oftentimes require a degree in and of itself. So if you don't have a college degree and you want to come to the US on a TN visa, one of the only options you have is management consultant. So U.S. Customs and Border Protection knows this, that it is one of the few categories that people without a degree can apply for. And they know that as a result, it's kind of a catch-all category. And so they scrutinize it. So when you apply to enter as a management consultant, they will take a close look at the application. So when I say that category is risky, there is a spectrum. There are riskier management consulting cases and there are less risky management consulting cases. If you have, if you're coming to the US to work at a management consulting firm, and what I mean by that is like McKinsey, Bain, BCG, those are the big ones. It could be Deloitte, Oliver Wyman. There are many of these management consulting companies. If you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting company where you essentially are serving a third party, right? You're going to have Pfizer hire McKinsey, and then your work is going to benefit Pfizer. You're not kind of consulting for McKinsey to help them with McKinsey's operations. You're helping a third party. If that's what you're coming to the US to do, that is not a risky management consultant application. Because it really does fit the mold of what a management consultant does. What is a risky management consulting category is if you're coming to the US to work for a company that's not a management consultant firm, so management consulting firm. So I like to use the example of a US company that designs, manufactures, and sells solar panels. Let's say that you are a national of Canada, you have a decade of experience in the solar panel industry, you're an expert in solar panels, and there's a US company that wants you to come to the US to help them improve their manufacturing of solar panels and their sales, whatever it is involving solar panels. So clearly a solar panel company is not a management consulting company. And your work as a consultant is going to directly benefit the US employer. It's not like they are hiring you out as a management consulting firm would to benefit other parties. That is a risky application because of the nature of the arrangement. Now, when I say it's risky, I'm not saying it'll be denied, and we actually have plenty of these applications being approved. There's no guarantee that that an application will be approved. Again, the risk does increase with these types of applications, but there are ways to improve your odds of getting approved. So what are some of those ways that you can improve your odds of getting approved if you're coming to the US as a management consultant for a company that is not a management consulting firm? One of the things you need to show in your application is that you really are coming to the US not to fill a permanent position, but to consult on a specific challenge for the US company. So going back to our example, it's important in that arrangement where you're coming to work for the solar panel company to define in the application what the specific challenge is that that solar panel company is facing. Maybe they really are struggling to lower the costs of their manufacturing. Maybe they are really struggling to sell their solar panels to a certain target population, either within the US or maybe outside the US. And so you're gonna help them address that specific problem. So you want to specifically define the challenge that you'll be helping them define. And that's in contrast to you coming to fill a permanent role. So let's say, you know, this solar panel company wants you to come in and work on their marketing, and they used to have someone in marketing, but that person wasn't that good. They left, and you're going to fill that role. That's not a good thing. The government wants to see you really are coming in temporarily to address a very discrete challenge or need. Ways to additionally make it clear that this is a management consulting arrangement and not an employment arrangement is the way that you are compensated and kind of your relationship with the US company. So oftentimes, being an independent contractor who is compensated based on your deliverables. If you have a specific challenge, you're going to spend the first month looking at X. You're going to spend the second month doing analysis, the third month presenting your recommendations to, management of the company. And based on each of those stages, you're going to be compensated, whether it's hourly or based on the actual deliverable. It's in contrast to a salary. A salary oftentimes suggests that this is a permanent position, which again is not good in the management consulting category. Again, if the employer is not a management consulting firm. So the more it looks like a consulting arrangement, the better. And the word that you'll hear the government use is supernumerary. So what that means is a supernumerary role is one that's not permanent at the company, right? You're coming in temporarily to address a unique challenge that's limited in time, and you're going to leave when that's done. So related to that, to additionally show that the position is supernumerary, is that you don't need the full 3 years. So a TN visa can be issued for up to 3 years. For a management consulting application, it can strengthen the application if you show in the application you don't need the full 3 years. So to actually address this discrete challenge, you're only going to need a year or 2 years. 3 years is going to raise questions. Why do you need that long if this really is a discrete challenge? So it can be a way to strengthen the application. That being said, if you are looking at entering in the management consulting category, that's a category where a lawyer really can help. We've had success in a number of these applications. It's not always the case that you can't get a 3-year TN visa for a management consultant. Sometimes you can. It really is the overall strength of the application and the way you're framing the whole thing. So that's the management consultant category. The economist category is also challenging, but it's challenging for different reasons. The economist category is challenging because the US government specifically issued a memo in 2017 that narrowed the scope of what a economist can do. So what that memo said was that economists cannot primarily be coming to the US to perform the job duties of financial analysts or market research analysts and marketing specialists. So you essentially can't come to the US as an economist and actually work in marketing or market research or financial analysts. What does that mean? Well, financial analysts, market research analysts, and marketing specialists, financial analysts tend to conduct, and I'm looking here at the actual language that the government uses. They primarily conduct quantitative analyses of information affecting investment programs. So basically, they are looking for opportunities to commit money for the purpose of generating profits. Market research analysts and marketing specialists, they are basically helping companies market their products and services. So let's contrast that with what economists are allowed to do. And to figure that out, you're going to go back to that resource that I mentioned before, the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So if you Google OOH, economist, click that link, click the tab at the top, what they do, you'll see that they research economic issues related to education, labor force, international trade, other topics. They conduct surveys, they collect data, they analyze that data using mathematical and economic models, they interpret and forecast trends. So you really do want, especially in the economist category, you really do want to make sure that the job you're coming to the US to do as an economist really is closely aligned with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says that an economist does. So what does the TN application process look like? Excuse me. I already mentioned that for Canadians, they can apply at a port of entry, which is, again, a very streamlined option. Almost always what a Canadian national will do to apply for a TN, they would bring their application with them to the port of entry. What does that packet look like? Of course, it's going to have their passport. It will have the letter from the US employer that describes the position being offered, how the individual is qualified for it, background on the individual, why they're a good fit for the role, who the US employer is, why they have a need for someone in this role. It'll say, how many years they intend to employ this person, at what salary. That's the employer letter, and that letter should have an original signature on it, and it should be on company letterhead. Customs and Border Protection encounters a lot of fraud, and so they generally will require original documentation. They will not consider copies. That's in contrast to USCIS, excuse me, which we'll talk about in a moment. USCIS, again, is where you apply if you're within the US, and they will accept copies. But if you're applying at a port of entry or at a consulate, you need to have original documentation. In addition to the passport, the employer letter, you'll have original documentation showing how you qualify. And again, that is qualify based on the TN regulations, not on what the employer wants to see. So again, let's say you're applying as an accountant. You don't have a professional degree. That's okay. The TN regulations say you can qualify based on your degree or your diploma. So you take with you to the port of entry or to the consulate your original diploma. I know that sounds crazy, but you need to take the original diploma. Sometimes, if your degree is related but not exactly the same as the occupation. So to take an example, you're applying as an accountant and you have a degree in finance rather than accounting. Finance is very closely related to accounting, if not effectively identical. But let's say you have a degree in economics instead of accounting, but you took many accounting courses to get your economics degree. You could bring your original diploma as well as your original transcript, and you would show on your transcript how you took a lot of accounting classes. So effectively, you have a bachelor's degree in accounting. So original diploma, original transcript if you need it, original passport, obviously, and original employer letter. Now, if you are applying based on experience, so we talked about the management consulting category, how you can qualify based on 5 years of experience in the area of specialty related to what you'll be doing in the US. So for our solar panel example, you need to bring letters from past employers talking about how you have been working on solar panels for 5 years. Those letters do need to have the original signatures as well. Again, CBP will not accept copies. So if you're applying based on experience, bring those original experience letters. For nationals of Mexico, if you're applying at a consulate, you'd bring exactly the same documents that I just listed. Passport, employer letter, proof that you qualify, whether that's experience, a diploma, your transcript, and you'd bring that with you to your interview at the consulate. To set up that interview, you'd first submit a DS-160, which is the online application for a visa at a consulate. Sometimes nationals of Mexico, if they have already had a TN visa, they'll be able to renew by mail. The consulate will let you know. Once you submit the DS-160, they'll actually send you instructions to renew by mail if you're eligible to do that, but they'll let you know afterward, after you submit the DS-160 and before your interview, of course. And finally, applying within the US, you can do that through USCIS. If you're here, you have status, say F1 student status, or something along those lines, you can apply to change your status to TN status. And to do that, you'd file an I-129, or the employer would file an I-129. And the supporting documents submitted with it would be identical to the ones I listed for either CBP for a Canadian or the consulate for a national of Mexico. And again, those can be copies if you're applying through USCIS. So tips and common pitfalls. We always recommend that you call the port of entry ahead of time if you're a national of Canada, and just make sure that you're familiar with the procedures there. Are there certain hours when you have to arrive? Sometimes, especially during the pandemic, at the heights of the pandemic, certain ports of entry were only receiving applications at certain hours. Some ports of entry see a lot of these applications, so they actually have very specific procedures you need to follow. So it's always good to call ahead and just make sure you know exactly where you need to go, and when you need to arrive. Best to avoid surprises on the day of. I mentioned before, the employer letter needs to have an original signature. The person who signs should be available at the time that you either go to the consulate for the interview or approach the port of entry. Because sometimes border officers or consular officers will call the person who signed that letter, just to make sure that the position is legitimate. And usually the questions are not especially detailed. It's really just to make sure this is a legitimate job offer. So it doesn't happen often, but best to be prepared. So just let the person who signed, could be an HR person, could be a manager, just let them know, hey, I'm planning to go to the port of entry tomorrow between noon and 3. If you could just have your phone on you in case you get a call, that would be appreciated. I said before, original documentation is critical at a consulate or the port of entry. So yes, bring a diploma, official transcripts, original signed version of the employer letter. If that's how the employer letter you'll need, but official transcripts and a diploma if that's how you are qualifying for the visa. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. So what that means is it is not a green card. You do need to plan to leave the US at the end of your stay on the TN. So be prepared to show your ties to Canada or Mexico. This usually doesn't come up if you haven't been on a TN for a number of years. So If it's your first time getting a TN, even a second time, they're usually not going to ask about your ties to Canada or Mexico. But if you've been renewing your TN for a while, and legally speaking, you can renew your TN indefinitely. There's not a limit to the period of time. But there comes a point where the officer might want to see, like, show me what ties do you have to Canada? You've been coming here for years. I want to see that you still have some ties back home. Be prepared to show bank statements showing that you have assets back in your home country if you own property there, things like that. Be prepared to show that. Great. I know some questions have come in, so let me go ahead and turn to those. So does software quality assurance, software quality engineering count in CSA stream? That is entirely going to come down to your job duties. So for any question, and we get these questions a lot, what about this job? Will this job count under the TN regulations? What matters is what you're going to be doing in the US. So step one is to figure out what your job duties for the US employer are going to be. Step two is to look at the list of TN occupations, see what titles sound similar to what you're going to be doing, and then go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and see if the job duties for those titles, for those occupations, are similar to what you'll be doing in the US. If they're somewhat similar, you might be able to work with the US employer and say, hey, for me to qualify for the TN, I'm going to have to do job duties that are more aligned with what you see on the OOH, the Occupational Outlook Handbook. Could we align what I'll be doing in the US so that they're more close to what the OOH says? And you have to actually be doing those things, right? It's not just presenting that. And many employers will say, yeah, we can modify your job duties so that most of your time is spent doing those things. But frankly, if the employer says, no, we can't do that, we're sticking with your job duties and they're not aligned, the TN might just not be the best option. You might need to consider an H-1B or another visa that's a better fit for what you'll be doing. You might consider a management consultant TN as well. So and even though the TN is challenging, it can be an option to come to the US on a TN to do work that is legitimately the work of a management consultant. Again, you do need to look to the OOH. What does a management consultant do? If you're advising on things, even if it's, improving an employer's software quality assurance, for example, you might be able to say, I'm coming to the US as a management consultant to advise on that. And it is a temporary role and I'm addressing a specific challenge, et cetera. The other things we talked about for the management consultant. So, of course, we can talk through that during a consultation, but if you want to look at it yourself, you would do what I just said. Look at your job duties and look at the regulations and the Occupational Outlook Handbook to see if the job is aligned. We will share the PowerPoint slides. You'll be getting an email after this presentation with a link where you can find those. As a Canadian citizen, can either my US-based LLC or my husband's US-based LLC sponsor my TN visa? The answer is no. That is going to, on the face of it, make you ineligible. So you cannot own the US employer that is going to employ you. Can your husband own it? Very much a gray area, risky. Definitely, if you want to talk through that, schedule a consultation. I think it's a risky proposition. Now, what you can do is you can own the Canadian or the Mexican employer. So let's say that you are a management consultant and you've started your own LLC in Canada to help solar panel companies improve their operations. And it's, John Doe LLC in Canada. That LLC can be hired by a US employer, and then your LLC can send you from Canada to the US. Now, when I say LLC, I'm talking a Canadian company. I'm not talking a US company. If you own the US company that you're going to be working for on a TN, that is not permitted. So be very careful about that. All right. I have a BA in chemistry and an MBA. Sometimes companies don't know about a TN visa. They think it's sponsorship. Yes, we see that a lot. We're happy to talk with the employer to talk through how it is not sponsorship. We do that sometimes. If you find a US employer that seems to be a good fit, they say, we really like you as a candidate, but we just don't sponsor employees. Then you can say, you can send our blog. We have blog posts on this. We have videos on this. You can send them the webinar. If you want, to hire us, we're happy to talk with the employer. Oftentimes, employers will want to work closely with us on these applications, which is perfectly fine. But we're happy to explain that this is not sponsorship as it is typically thought of in the green card or H-1B or U.S. immigration context. Can you technically apply for a TN visa without involvement from the company trying to hire you as long as they give you a signed offer letter with the job duties? Well, so if a U.S. employer has given you an offer letter, a signed offer letter with job duties, I mean, that's the involvement that's required if you're applying at a port of entry. So yeah, I mean, if you're a Canadian applying at a port of entry, or if you're a national in Mexico applying at a consulate, that's really all you need is that employer letter. It's more than an offer letter, but not much more, because it is more than an offer letter, because an offer letter is usually going to just say, here's what you're going to be doing, here's your title, here's how much you'll be paid. An employer letter, a TN employer letter, is going to tie that to the TN regulations. So, here's who we want to employ, here's who we are as an employer, here's how our candidate qualifies for the TN. They have a bachelor's degree, whatever it is, and here's what they're going to be doing. Here's how long we want to employ them at what salary. So the employer letter is not much more than an offer letter. But once they give you that employer letter, original, signed, there's not much more for the employer to do. You apply at a port of entry or the consulate, come into the US, and you start working for them. The exception, as I mentioned, is USCIS. So if you're within the US, the employer will have to sign the I-129, but that's, we will oftentimes prepare that working with the employee, and then we'll just give the form to the employee who will send it to the employer, or we can send it directly to the employer. They'll sign it. They'll say, yep, looks good, sign it. And that's the extent of their involvement. It's really not much. The TN, again, is probably, if not the easiest visa option to work in the US for now. And, if you're a national of Canada or Mexico looking to work in the US, the TN is going to be the first option we look at. It just really is a great option. All right, I am already on a TN working for a US employer. I've received an offer from another employer. They're willing to file the I-129 with the USCIS for the new TN. They're saying I need to be in the US while the I-129 is being processed. When my current employer filed the I-129, I was in Canada. What's the requirement? Am I required to be in Canada? So basically, let me take a step back, because there are a couple things I did not say before that I think are really can be beneficial for a TN. The first is you don't have to work full-time. So the TN can be to work part-time. The other thing is that you can work for more than one US employer on a TN. So let's say one employer wants you to work there for 15 hours a week, and the other wants you to work for 15 hours a week. That can be perfectly fine in a TN context. The important thing to know, though, is that you must receive approval before you work for a US employer. So if you're in the US on a TN, another company likes you, you start working for the other company before you've let USCIS know and they've approved it, that's unauthorized work. You don't want to do that because that could compromise your future visa applications, your current status. It's just not something you want to do. Always wait for the USCIS approval or CBP approval if you're going that route before you start working for an employer in the US. Excuse me. So let's get to the question. I think what the question is really asking is for an I-129, meaning a USCIS application, do you need to be inside the US? And for the TN, there is an exception where a US employer can file the I-129, you can be outside the US, and then once the I-129 is approved, you get the approval outside the US, so your employer can send it to you. and then you enter through CBP with your USCIS approval. Some employers prefer to do that because they want that certainty, as opposed to, um, say, you applying through CBP and just not knowing if you're going to be approved or not. Some employers will say, we'll just file the I-129, and if you get an approval, then we'll take steps from there, and that's okay to do. So yes, the other downside, by the way, of applying with USCIS is that it is more expensive. So applying at a consulate, it's not going to be too expensive. At a border, I think it's just over 50 US dollars. Um, However, applying through USCIS, they recently updated the fees, and I am pretty sure that it is going to be in the realm of $510. I'm not going to take the time to look it up right now, but you can look it up. I-129 filing fee, they changed on April 1st. The nice thing, so downside of USCIS is the cost. One of the benefits is you can apply for premium processing for a TN. So if you're already in the US, you want a decision within 14 business days, then you can apply for premium processing. USCIS will get you a decision. That is expensive. So the premium processing fee also increased on April 1st. So you're looking at a couple $1,000s for that expedited process. And again, Canadians, it's hard to beat the CBP option. It is far cheaper. It's an immediate decision as soon as you go to the border. So for Canadians, even with premium processing, USCIS usually is not going to make a ton of sense, but in some circumstances it does. Could you please talk about the change of employer or adding an employer to your current status? Yes, so basically you, as I mentioned, you can have a concurrent TN where you have authorization to work for 2 TN employers. Basically, what you would do is have 2 independent TN applications. And as I've already described, the application packet for a TN is not all that intensive. It's a letter from the employer, proof that you qualify, and that's really it. So if you bring that for 2 different positions, again, 2 signed employer letters, and those letters should logistically make sense. So if you have two TN opportunities and each are saying you're going to work 40 hours a week for $120,000 a year, CBP is probably going to say, how are you going to work full time for 2 employers, especially if they're in different cities? So just make sure that it makes sense. Excuse me. But that's how you would do it. You would bring with you 2 independent TN applications, whether to CBP, whether to the consulate, USCIS, you would let them know if you currently have TN status that you're applying for a concurrent TN, and you'd give that information to USCIS, but it's a fairly straightforward process to do that. And same with changing an employer. So let's say you're at one TN employer and another approaches you and says, we want to hire you full-time instead of the employer where you are. You basically, if you're a Canadian, you have the option of USCIS or the border. And you would submit the application for the new TN employer. And again, you can't start for the new TN employer until you have that approval. That's very, very important. I'm currently a TN management consultant, and a new employer is willing to support me with applying for a new management consultant visa. Is my existing TN with the current employer under any risk of being canceled or affected? It depends. It depends if the old employer intends to keep employing you. It depends on whether logistically you're able to do both. But if both employers are on the same page that you're going to be working for both, and your application, like I said, logistically makes sense in terms of the number of hours and what you're going to be doing, it shouldn't be a problem to have 2 engagements on a TN management consultant visa. You know, I said before, management consultants, that really is the one of the 2 riskiest categories, generally speaking. And you increase the risk as you add employers. So for each one, you need to qualify. So just be careful that you are, addressing all of the risks that I said before for both of those opportunities. But frankly, they can be approved. So, it can work. be honest and just work with the employers to craft a strong application, as I mentioned earlier. I have an H-4 visa. I'm in the US. If I find a company that offers me a job, do I need to go outside the country and do all the steps, or could I change my status? Generally speaking, you can change your status within the US. I mean, you have to have not violated your status in the US. That is a bar to changing your status within the US. But assuming that you've complied with your H-4 visa, haven't violated your status, then generally applying for a change of status through USCIS is an option for almost anyone who's in the US in H-4 status. Can a small startup or LLC then sponsor a TN visa for a qualified worker? They can. The requirements for the LLC, I mean, they need to sign an employer letter. So if it's a startup can certainly support a TN worker, and a TN worker can get a TN to work for a startup. The important things to do in that case are you do want to show that this startup has the financial ability to pay you, and that they have a need for someone in your role. So just to use an example, let's say that there is a startup and they want to hire you as a TN lawyer, paying you $200,000 a year. Excuse me. Lawyers, that is a TN category. You can qualify as a lawyer. However, the CBP officer, USCIS, or the consulate is probably going to ask, why does a startup need a general counsel? And can this startup actually pay someone $200,000 a year? It's not typical for a startup to be able to do that. But if you can show this is a startup that's received a lot of venture capital funding or funding from angel investors, whatever it is, then you can make the argument that, hey, we are a startup, but we do need a general counsel. Here's what we're going to pay. Here's how we're able to pay. We already have these clients on board, and you can make the argument. So certainly a startup can support a TN worker. If I have been denied a TN visa, can I apply again? You can. Be prepared to explain the previous denial. The government will typically keep notes about past denials. So, it can be something that you need to explain when you apply again. But if you apply with a good explanation and being ready to address any questions that come up about that past denial, you can certainly apply again. And depending on the basis for the past denial, you can oftentimes be approved in spite of a past denial. Though, of course, it does depend on the basis of the past denial. Some denials are based on, pretty significant violations of the law. And in that case, a second application might not be approved. For a Canadian citizen, is E2 or TN better? What are options that lead to a green card after the E2 or TN? That's an excellent question. The E2 is the visa that we handle most often, and the E2 is where you want to develop and direct a business in the US. So you have to be the 50% owner of the business in the US to be an E2 investor. And that's in direct contrast to a TN, where you can't get the TN if you're a 50% owner of the business in the US. So it depends on what your goals are. If you want to be an entrepreneur and you actually want to be the one managing the business, then the E2 is clearly the better option. And the E2 is also a wonderful option. It's not as straightforward or streamlined as the TN, but it is a wonderful option for anyone who wants to own and manage a business in the US. So I think that's the first thing I would ask is, do you want to manage the business? Do you want to own the business? If the answer is yes, the E2 is going to be your option because the TN is not your option. In terms of leading to a green card, TN both can, neither leads to a green card. For a green card in the US, you need to independently qualify for the green card. So green cards can be applied for based on a family relationship or your relationship to an employer if they want to sponsor you. So if you're here on a TN and your employer wants to sponsor you for an employer-based green card, You can certainly pursue a green card that route. If you're here on an E2 and you want to apply for a green card, the EB2 NIW or the EB5 job creation green card are very common options for the E2 to apply for a green card. We have webinars on the EB5, on the EB2 NIW. So check those out. For the TN, it can be tricky just because you need to maintain, your TN while you're waiting for the green card to be approved. And that can be tricky because once you file a green card application, it can be very difficult to apply for a non-immigrant visa like an E2 or a TN. However, the E2 is typically issued for 5 years and the TN for at most 3 years. And then if you apply through USCIS, it's going to be 2 years of status that you get there. So you're looking at shorter periods of time. So you just need to be very strategic if you're moving from a TN to a green card. Excuse me, a bit stopped up. Apologize for that. This is an area where I would definitely recommend you reach out to a lawyer. So moving from a non-immigrant visa to a green card has a number of pitfalls that you just don't want to fall into. So talk with a lawyer if you're thinking about doing that. It can be worth your while to do that. I'm on an approved H-1B. Can I qualify for future TN visa for the same job role? The question is going to be whether it's in one of the listed occupations, if the job duties are aligned, and if you qualify. So being here on an H-1B doesn't directly impact the TN. You would see if you independently qualify for the TN if you're here on an H-1B. I'm a Mexican citizen and I'm a veterinarian. Can I still be eligible for a TN even though I don't have my veterinary boards? And with that being said, if my job duty does not match strictly with the OOH handbook. So we have talked about this during the presentation. It is important that your job duties are aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook. If they are not aligned, it's very likely you will be denied. So work with the employer to make sure you're doing the things that the Occupational Outlook Handbook says a veterinarian does. In terms of a license, it depends. If you are qualifying based on having a license, then you need the license. And if you don't, you are going to be denied. If you don't need the license, so for example, let's say that you're applying to come to the US as a lawyer on a TN, so you can qualify as a lawyer through either a degree or a license. And that's interesting because to practice law in the US, you need a license. But what the law says, the TN regulations say, is that, I should say policy, TN policy, is that you cannot be denied a TN just because you don't have a license to practice. And again, if the license is to qualify for the job, then you can be denied. But if you can qualify for the job based on a degree, you can qualify based on the degree. And let's say, you go to your interview for the lawyer TN and they say, well, but you don't have a license. You can tell them, oh, I'm going to enter in TN and I'll be performing certain duties for the employer as a lawyer. I won't be able to, give legal advice, obviously, without that, that bar permission, but I'm going to take the bar once I'm there on a TN. That is okay. You should not be denied just because you don't have a license to practice the profession if that license is not part of the qualification as in the regulations. I have studied master's and I'm a Canadian citizen. Can I apply for a TN as my bachelor's 3 years from India? It's going to depend. So it raises an important question, which is if you are qualifying based on a degree, and your degree is from an institution in the US, Canada, or Mexico, you do not need an educational equivalency certificate. That's where you get a third party to basically certify that your degree from another country is equivalent to a certain degree in the US. You don't need that if your degree is from Canada, Mexico, or the US. You do need that if your degree is from anywhere else. I had a client from the London School of Economics, outstanding school. You need that degree equivalency, which is surprising, but you need it. So that is going to say, hey, your degree is equivalent to a US bachelor's, and that's how you'll know if you qualify. Now, If you have something equivalent, going back to the question, to a US master's, that is going to generally be okay. So let's say that you're applying as an economist, your bachelor's degree is in English, completely unrelated, will not allow you to qualify based on the degree, but you have a master's in economics. That master's is going to be sufficient because you're qualifying based on the degree. And if it says you need a bachelor's in economics, a master's is going to be a good substitute. What's the better way to tell the companies about the offer letter? I'm not sure what the question is asking, but generally speaking, you would have a discussion with the employer, listing out the job duties. Share the Occupational Outlook Handbook. We're happy to do that if you hire us. What the requirements for the TNR. Once you've developed those job duties and make sure they're aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook, they can write up that employer letter and with the details of the role and sign it, and you should be good to go. So we are at time. Thank you all for the great questions, really excellent questions. I appreciate it. Do keep an eye out for our email with links to our YouTube channel, the PowerPoint presentation, the TN guide, really a lot of great resources we're proud to put out there. So do check that out. And if we can be helpful, please sign up for a consultation. We're always happy to talk with you. So thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day.